A few weeks ago, while brainstorming, I suddenly thought it might be interesting to make a game where the world is shaped like a circle. How would a game like that even work? Would it be easy to implement? And would it have any surprising gameplay implications? What I found is a type of design that behaves similar to a normal one, but differs in ways I couldn't even imagine. So I'm going to share exactly how I made this game, as well as the special features exclusive to this design. The first thing I did was set up the circular world in which every object exists. My method for doing this is actually conceptually very simple. Basically, instead of the game using a Cartesian coordinate system, where two coordinates represent the vertical and horizontal positions along a grid, it uses a polar coordinate system, where an angle and radius are used to represent the position along a circle. This might sound intimidating, but really all it means is that to make a game like this, you simply have to substitute the traditional x and y values with angle and radius values. This also shows that I'm not just making a normal game with circular rooms. I'm making a game where the world itself is circular, if that makes sense. The problem is that most game engines don't really expect to be used in this way, so to force it to work, I created an object that has a Cartesian position that functions as the origin to everything else's polar position. It also has a radius to define how big the game area is. I could now add objects like the player, but in order to get them to draw properly, I still needed to convert their polar coordinates to Cartesian ones, which is thankfully very easy with a couple of simple equations. The sprite is also rotated to match the object's position. One thing that's neat about this implementation is that it's actually possible to change the size of the game area while remaining kind of proportional. But here's an interesting question. How fast should the player move rotationally? Maybe something like 20 degrees per second? But while that might seem appropriate in a bigger room, it would be absolutely sluggish in a small one, because no matter the size, all circles have 360 degrees. So how do we solve this problem? Well, at least what I did is make the player's speed a constant divided by the room's radius. This means that the player can maintain a consistent speed for any given room while adapting to different sizes. The next issue I tackled was the camera, because the camera also rotates around the circle in order to keep the player's on-screen position stable. I've actually never implemented camera rotation in a 2D game before, so I expected it to be kind of difficult, but it really wasn't. You just change its angle value and it works. But there is another huge problem. For multiple reasons, rotating low-resolution sprites in a low-resolution game looks horrendous. There's just not enough pixels to represent anything accurately. The good news is that there's a couple of simple ways to make it look better. You can either make the sprites higher resolution, the camera higher resolution, or both. I chose the camera, which works well. I then added the walls, enemies, and spikes. Since I had already implemented the player at this point, it was fairly easy to copy over all of the specialized code and design everything else pretty much as normal. The only big challenge was getting the walls to draw properly, since they have to arc across their entire width. I considered a few solutions, but the one that made the most sense to me was to use a triangle strip. To do this, you sample a bunch of points along the curved parts and turn those into the vertices. I thought the effect looked really good, so I also used it for the room's edges. With all of the level elements in place, I now had to write the collision system, which is where some really weird properties of this world shape become apparent. First is that since the level loops around on itself, you need to make sure that all of your rotational measurements are looped as well, so an object should never really have a position more than 360 degrees. Another one is that two completely different coordinates can represent the same position on the screen. For example, if you're standing on opposite sides of the circle and jump really high. This means that if you want an object to be able to interact with things on the other side of the circle, you need to check for collisions a second time at the corresponding height of the opposite angle. Coordinates of any angle can also meet in the very center. As for the collisions themselves, I decided to make use of this system's equivalent of hitboxes, which are more like hit arcs. They function mostly like normal hitboxes, registering a collision if they overlap. The only issue is that they become thinner as they approach the center, leading to some distortion. I'm sure there's a way to dynamically change the hitboxes to properly adapt to the radius, though honestly I never really found the need to implement one since most collisions in this game take place near the ground anyway. Now, I could finally begin actually designing levels, but this would prove to be one of the most difficult challenges of the project. Remember how I said that most game engines don't really expect to be used in this way? Well, that extends to the level editors too, so I can't really use them for this part. There's also the question of how can you progress through levels, considering that you're trapped in essentially a single room. For the second problem, I felt that the natural solution was to add a bell object that, when triggered, fades to the next layout. Your goal is essentially to ring the bell as many times as possible, but before you can ring it again, you need to make a lap around the circle. I actually had a lot of difficulty coming up with a solution for how the bell can detect a lap. I was initially considering using checkpoints and other complex systems, but I think the solution I settled on is much more elegant. The bell simply records the direction the player was traveling when exiting its hitbox, and only triggers when the player enters in the same direction. This is only possible if you wrap around all the way to the other side. And here's a neat detail, the bell even rings in the same direction. The bell also changes the background color, but this is only cosmetic. So how did I end up making the level layouts? I knew that designing them manually without any specialized tools would be a massive pain, so I instead made an algorithm to generate them randomly. The algorithm is fairly simple and just places a random amount of elements in random places without much consideration, though it does avoid placing elements near the bell, and it scales the amount of elements with how big the circle is, meaning it does actually support levels that change in radius. It also snaps features like the edges of walls to equally spaced positions about 16 units apart, to replicate the consistent feel of using a tile set. The game was now mostly functional, and I could begin properly playtesting it. And personally, I think it's pretty enjoyable. The movement feels good, avoiding obstacles is engaging, and it certainly helps having unlimited levels to play. So with all of that being said, is there any good reason to actually use this world shape? Well, I think there's definitely some amount of novelty value, since not many games have levels that look like this. I also appreciate that it gives a choice in which direction to tackle the level. There are definitely certain obstacles that are easier to avoid in one direction, so it adds a bit of strategy and agency. You can also see a lot more of the level at once, which makes obstacles easier to prepare for. There's also a final benefit that's probably the most substantive. Since the level is circular, it's possible for obstacles to affect you from all around, as can be seen with the ring enemies. This means that you might have to deal with an obstacle multiple times on a single lap, opening up more possibilities for clever level layouts. Maybe the player could even have options to attack the enemy back, making it important to be aware of the level as a whole instead of just the slice that you're in. This world shape does have some drawbacks though. Designing levels can be difficult and maybe even restrictive since everything has to take place inside a circle. Platforming also feels a bit unintuitive since your position in the air doesn't as easily show where you'll land on the ground. And though I haven't personally experienced it, I do wonder if some people might feel a bit nauseous watching the world constantly spin around. So could I see myself turning this concept into a finished game? Maybe. I'm not sure if it could as easily be turned into a grand adventure or anything, but I've grown to appreciate it over time, and I could definitely see some potential as a smaller experimental project. But what do you think? Is this game something you'd be interested to play? And how do you feel about the strange world shape that defines it? Thanks for watching. Bye.